Good news, everybody. Synology reached out. They said, I'm summarizing several emails here and it's taking a little bit of creative liberty here, but we noticed that you do NAS videos from time to time and that you're just sort of DIYing. It's like, and you're also into Linux. We use Linux for our NAS. You want to take a look at one? You know, what's the thing here? And so I agreed to take a look at one of their NAS units, but my conditions were unpaid and I've got to return it when I'm done, and they don't get any control over anything that I say. It's like, it was basically, if you want to send me a NAS, send me a NAS. I'm going to borrow a NAS from you. I'm going to do an honest evaluation. You can't look at it ahead of time or anything like that, like my review. You don't get any editorial control, basically, and I will agree to send it back. So no money changes hands, no paid review, no pre-roll. That's not how we roll here at Level 1. So they sent me a NAS to take a look at, to get my honest opinion on. Is Linux good? Did we do it? Is it great? Is it awesome? What is it? Let's take a look. Here we are with the Synology NAS, 60 terabytes. So I've got 6 Seagate Iron Wolf 10 terabyte hard drives that I have borrowed. And I have been punishing those hard drives. It's like, I've got to send this back. So I'm going to try to break it by using it normally. It seems like Seagate has really done their homework here to try to make the drive as quiet as possible. So even though, they're enterprise-ish grade, I guess, because they're NAS. I mean, they're designed to be on 24 hours a day. They're still very, very quiet. And it was like, hey, I noticed that this model has a PCI Express slot. I'm going to jam a 10 gig Ethernet card in there and see what happens. And they were like, nah. So this thing has been running torture tests basically for a couple of months. I actually forgot about it over Christmas. And I came back and I was like, oh, like 7 terabytes have been transferred. So yeah, that was fun. But what is a NAS? It's a network attached hard drive. It's really all it is. You can do a lot of other cool stuff with it. You can make it a print server, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You can use an external hard drive. You can use it for backups. Even though it's Linux-based, it actually works really well with Windows and Mac. You can use it to back up your laptop or to back up your desktop. So, if your laptop were lost, you can back everything up to this thing, and it's basically good to go. If you're a photo nut or a video nut like we are, 60 terabytes in a shoebox. If you're in a small apartment and you want a server, but if you're in a small apartment, something like this is a great choice because you can use it for storage, for backups, archives, but you can also install other stuff on it and run plugins. So it's basically a full Linux machine and a nice sexy little package that you can do whatever you want with. Now this one has an Atom processor. It's a 4-core, 4-thread Atom processor. And it's all point and click easy. You don't have to be a super nerd. You don't have to be like super detailed to really get into it and dot the I's and cross the T's. It's Linux based, and Linux is a 4-letter word to some people, but it's really irrelevant that it's based on Linux. It could be based on like some crazy moon language and it wouldn't really matter. It's got a great point and click web interface, and it also integrates with Synology's cloud. So if you want to sign up for Synology, you can access this thing without having to reconfigure your firewall or do anything crazy like that wherever you are. So you can have your own sort of self-powered cloud. If you've got your music and movies and stuff like that stored on here, there's a Plex plugin, there's media plugins. You can use this thing to host all of that, and you can still access it even when you're out of the office, even when you're working remotely. It's pretty cool. There's a lot you can do in the Synology software ecosystem, and a lot of it is free and open source, and you can DIY it. Setting up the Synology is pretty easy. You can usually just go to DiskStation:5000, or if DHCP hands out internet access on your local network, it'll actually connect to Synology when you plug it in, so you can set up an account with them. So if you have a Synology account, you can sign up for that, and this will let you connect. Even if you have a really restrictive firewall, you can still connect back to this unit because it'll actually tunnel through your firewall. So I don't really want to do that, so I'm gonna skip this step down here at the bottom, but that's just because I'm like super paranoid. But you can set this up with them, and that makes it easier for for Synology to offer you cloud services and all that kind of stuff. So we can do a quick guided tour of the DSM. It'll also prompt you to update your software if you want, and install updates automatically, or notify you and ask you when you want to do updates. But To allow me to locate it via font. No, I'm not going to do that. It's like device analysis. Helps you enabling us to improve your. Nope. So it's a web-based GUI, so I can discover applications, and we can add applications. So like if I wanted to run blogging software on this or whatever, but you gotta keep in mind the CPU horsepower in this thing, it's a little limited. I mean, it's plenty of horsepower for a NAS, but if you want to go nuts installing, like a web server and a whole bunch of other things, it's a little more limited. I mean, it's not infinite resources. It's made to be a NAS. So I've been playing with this for a little while, and there's some updates. I've reset it to I've reset this thing back to factory settings so we can do this video. But there's an update. So let's download the update. So with this, we've enabled SSH, and it is pretty easy to SSH into it. At that point, you've got a Linux terminal. If you do enable SSH, please make sure that you've chosen a secure username and a very secure password. Now, since this thing has external ports, it's got eSATA ports, 2 of them, it's got USB. This thing can be a print server, depending on what kind of printer you have. I mean, it's not going to work with every printer. One other cool feature of the Synology is that it does support Btrfs or BTRFS. Now, this is creating BTRFS volumes on, inside of an LVM MD disk. So this is not using BTRFS's like redundant device support, which I can't blame them. I'm going to go for ext4, however. Nothing against Btrfs, it's just not ZFS. One other cool feature of the disk station is something that they call the package center. Now the package center lets you install other applications on your NAS. Now you can't go nuts because remember, 4-core, 4-thread Atom, limited amount of memory, but you can install things like active backup for Office 365, tools for replicating this Synology NAS to another Synology NAS, cloud sync tools, Plex media server, but there's also other media servers you can try out, iTunes, mail. I wouldn't really recommend using it as a mail server, but you could try that. There's a ton of stuff that you can install and experiment with, and really use your NAS for stuff that is not really, stuff that's more like server-oriented stuff. A NAS is not a server, but for, a few users, you can kind of get away with it for some applications. All right, looks like our update has updated completely. I'm just gonna hit update now, and this is it's like, please note the system cannot be powered off while this thing is being updated, and we're gonna reset immediately. So if anybody was using this thing, you'd have to let them know. It's a yes. It's like, look at that, it's doing stuff. My goodness. So Synology under the hood is Linux, but they've done a lot to make it user-friendly. So when you're plugging in a bunch of hard drives, we've got 6 10 terabyte Seagate Iron Wolf drives in this thing, which are great for network attached storage. You can configure how much redundancy and how much speed you want. If you want to, you could mirror 10 terabytes across all 6 disks so that all 6 of them would have to fail for you to lose your data. Of course, in that scenario, probably it's more likely that a virus attack or something like that, is what causes you to lose all of your data. But most people are not interested in that level of redundancy. They want to balance some bit of performance and some bit of speed. It supports RAID 5 and RAID 6. With RAID 5, we would have 5 drives worth of storage and 1 drive's worth of redundancy. So we would have about 50 terabytes of usable space. Of course, that's divide by 10, not divide by 2, because it's not powers of 2. We're not going to get into that whole thing. RAID 6 would give us 4 drives of usable space, and any 2 drives could fail. But Synology also supports SHR, and SHR stands for Synology Hybrid RAID. Now, it sounds proprietary, but it's actually not. It's just the Linux LVM stuff, plus the Linux software MD RAID stuff. One of the things that I really like about Synology is because they use Linux under the hood, they're using MD. And so if something catastrophic happens, you can take your disks out and put them in a Linux box and recover your data pretty easily. SHR lets you use different size disks. MD doesn't let you do that, the Linux multi-disk utility. So if you have like a 10 terabyte drive and a 4 terabyte drive and an 8 terabyte drive, what it does is it will slice up the drives so that there's different pieces of data in different places, and it'll maintain enough copies of the data so that any one drive can fail. It can get a little more complicated to figure out so that you've got at least one copy in case any one drive fails. And it doesn't work great if you've got a lot of large drives and then a few small drives, because it may not be possible to achieve full capacity redundancy if you've got a 10 terabyte drive and then 5 1 terabyte drives. That if the 10 terabyte drives die, I mean, it's not gonna work exactly, and you'll run into that when you try to use the GUI to figure that out. SHR2 is 2 drives of redundancy, so if 2 drives die, it's a recoverable situation. Early warning signs with smart diagnostics, which is built into the software. That's another Synology feature that they make really user-friendly for noobs. So it's going to email you, and it's like, oh, a drive has died, and then you'll have to do something to try to recover that drive, or to try to deal with it, or take action so that you don't lose any data. Well, you know what? Let's do SHR2. I mean, why not? Let's see what Synology has to offer for our particular interface. Now with SHR2, I'm going to expect to have about 40 terabytes of space available, and again, Linux MD. You can run, SSHN and run MDstat. And if you run MDstat before you've actually created any volumes, you'll see that the Synology is already using some small slices off of your physical disk. Yeah, it creates 6 mirrors, 6 replicas of information that it needs to manage the system across all 6 drives. So you'll have a little tiny slice of your drives that are installed in your Synology. In my case, 6 10 terabyte Seagate Ironwolf drives. You have a little slice of that used for tracking and control, metadata, and that kind of thing, but most of the drives are empty, and so that's where our volume is going to go. So parity consistency check is currently running on the storage pool 1 and may affect the overall system performance. Basically, it's initializing right now, and so the performance is going to be considerably lower than it is under normal operation. Now, if you want, you can add an SSD cache. We don't physically have enough room in the system to add an SSD cache, but if we wanted to add an eSATA SSD, that's totally an option. I think we can also add a PCI Express SSD, and because Linux doesn't care, and it'll show up and be fine. Hot spare is also a cool thing where you could use one drive as a standby drive. I think that in general, I don't recommend hot spares because we're not talking about a large number of disks. If we're talking about a disk shelf where I've got 20 disks or 24 disks, a hot spare can make sense. But because it takes so long, I mean, 10 terabytes, let's say a disk dies and we replace it and we put in a new disk, it's going to take overnight or more, maybe full 24 hours to re-image that 10 terabyte disk, just because the interface speed versus the capacity, the interface speed's not really that fast on a 10 terabyte piece of, a mechanical hard drive. So I think that having the replica already in place is probably a better situation. The idea is that you will not have been using the hot spare, whenever it's a year or 2 down the road, you will not have been using the hot spare when a drive dies. So it's basically new. It's basically just been sitting there ready to go. But with only, 5 or 6 slots in an enclosure like this, I'm not sure that a hot spare really makes sense. Now, in terms of off-label uses, I wanted to put a 10 gig Ethernet card in it and see what happens, and I also wondered what would happen with SMB multichannel. I've got some good news to report. Now, SMB multichannel was one of the first videos that I did at level 1 because it can be hard to get SMB multichannel to work correctly. And what that is basically you just plug in multiple network connections and it makes it faster. Now, at a single gigabit connection on this NAS, you can expect about 100 megabytes per second read and write. I mean, that's the limit of gigabit. I mean, 120 megabytes per second is the absolute max, but usually real world, it's around a gigabyte per second. But you can plug in LAN 1 and LAN 2 and LAN 3 and LAN 4 if you really want to, but you can plug in LAN 2, and that's the biggest bang for the buck, because then you'll start to see file transfers and things like that creep up to 170, 180, 190, around 200 megabytes per second. And the way that works is SMB multichannel. Now, SMB multichannel means that the client can request multiple streams from a server and put it all back together. The Synology is using Samba 4.4, which is one of the first releases to support SMB multichannel, although it is experimental. Now, experimental means that it's highly experimental, and I've done a lot of experimentation on SMB multichannel. Now, I happen to be running this version of Samba for a couple of years now with SMB multichannel enabled. It's what we run internally here on our network, and it's been largely fine. There have been some bugs that have been corrected by the Samba team, but in my testing of this Synology NAS, I mean, I've really put it through a torture test the last couple of months, and I did not experience any data corruption issues, just leaving it talking to a couple of PowerShell scripts and a couple of Windows systems. We're talking about 7.5, 8 terabytes of information transferred continuously over and over again just to see what would happen, just to do validation testing. And I didn't have any corruption, which is very impressive. There was some weird behavior. At times, the transfer speed would drop to like 60 or 70 megabytes per second, but I think it was probably just background processes running on the NAS. 99.9% of the time, it was fast. It was 160, 170 megabytes per second. It's not enabled by default. If you want to enable it, you've got to edit your SMB configuration on the NAS. So the SMB multi-channel thing was one of the last things that I really wanted to test with this platform to make sure that it worked, and it does. So that's exciting. Now, just for giggles, I also wanted to test 10 gigabit Ethernet because, yeah, let's just throw a 10 gigabit Ethernet card in there and see what happens. With 10 gigabit Ethernet, I was able to push the network connection even a little higher at about 500 megabytes per second. At about 500 megabytes per second, we've pegged all 4 of our Atom CPUs, and it just cannot keep up. I also tried to do some performance tuning so that I could run 3 or 4 gigabit connections with SMB multi-channel, and you can, but the easiest thing is to just enable SMB multi-channel and be happy with the approximately 200 megabytes per second that gives you, and you only have to use 2 gigabit connections. My mind is blown. Good job, Synology. I'm going to hang out in the level 1 forum. If you decide to pick up one of these, or you're troubleshooting one of these and doing data recovery or whatever, join us in the forum at Level 1 Techs. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there. That is testing SMB multi-channel, and I really thought that, oh, there's the boiler snake.